I'm here today with this fresh off the blocking boards test knit that I knitted in a completely different yarn than what the pattern recommended, and it made me think it's about time to talk about yarn substitution. Hello, welcome to Show and Tell Meg. I'm Megan, and I like to make things. If you've been around any amount of time, you'll know that I have been doing a lot of knitting lately. One of the things that I have really enjoyed doing is test knitting. I actually did a video on test knitting a little while back if you want to check that out. And I vaguely mentioned this one because I had signed up for the project, but I had not started knitting it yet. Now it is finished and I am super happy with how it came out actually. But like I said, I used a completely different yarn than what this pattern recommends. So this is the Marina Vest. It's a feather and fan design, very simple button front vest. It was actually a very quick project. Once I actually started knitting it, it took me like 2.5 weeks to make this. And that was with doing a sock project at the same time. So real quick, real fun. I always love a feather and fan. It's a classic design, just looks pretty and lacy. And so I was very keen to test this out when I saw that it was an option on Yarn Pond. It's called the Marina Vest. It's by Rita Dowd, who is Lumen Crafted online. And she has given permission to post about it, so it's okay that I talk about it. But this is an incredibly detailed pattern. I was very surprised that for something that seems like a pretty simple garment that she went into such detail, to be perfectly honest. So there's the little plug. I also had zero problems with this pattern. It has not been published yet, but I will let you know in my community tab when that does happen if you want to get this pattern for yourself. But in the pattern, Rita recommends that you use cotton yarn. In fact, she recommends that you use the same yarn that I just used on my Christmas sweater that I crocheted, which is Hobie Friends Cotton 8/8 size, and it's the DK weight 100% cotton. Since this was a test knit and I have such a crazy stash, I am not sure how much of a vest wearer I would be. So I didn't want to run out and buy more yarn. I wanted to work with stuff I had in my stash. And so knowing that this pattern took a DK weight yarn, I took to my Ravelry stash, which I do keep very accurate. I weigh everything that comes in and out of my stash. There are photos. There is every bit of information, how much I paid for it, where I got it, etc. on my Ravelry, which I am planning on doing a video about putting your stash on Ravelry. I just have not quite figured out the mechanics of it yet, but I'm going to have that at some point in the future. So if you don't use Ravelry already for your stash, just know I'm a solid believer, and the only way to have a big stash is to have some kind of a digital record of it. And that is exactly how this project was even possible to come to pass. So I went into my stash on Ravelry and I selected for the size of the yarn and the approximate quantity that I was going to need. And to be completely frank, I was very limited in my choice. I only had a few DK options, and a lot of them I already mentally had earmarked for something different. So I was trying to come up with what in my stash needs to get used that would work for this project. And while I had hoped to have a cotton yarn at least, I didn't. It just flat out wasn't in the cards. But I knew that something this simple type of shape, I could easily switch over to wool. And so that's exactly what I did. I made my vest using Hobie Black Friday wool. I think this was from last Black Friday, and they sold it in a 5-pack, like you had to buy 5, and they listed as DK. It's a little thinner than that, to be completely honest. Like, just going by using lots of yarn, I would say this is a little closer to sport. So it's a light DK if I'm being generous, but even Ravelry does list it as a DK. So I went with that. And I had 5 skeins of this. This is the curry colorway. So it's this nice mustard yellow, as you can see. And I knew it was a color I would wear. I don't know. It just felt right. And so this is what I decided to make this project out of. To be honest, I was hoping to use up a bit more of this. I still have a little over 1.5 skeins left out of my 5-pack. So this is also very yarn efficient, if I do say so myself. And since I was testing the pattern itself, I was going for similar sized yarn. I still made sure that I got gauge with this yarn. Then I followed the instructions exactly as written because I was testing the pattern itself out. I'm trying to make sure that I understand it, that everything knits up in a similar way to what is intended. And I ended up with this vest. So clearly the pattern was well written and everything worked out fine. But I was watching one of Deborah Knit's videos a couple of weeks ago, and she talked about how apparently newer knitters, like people who are more beginner, it's more of a common trend to not yarn substitute anymore, which is kind of this mind-boggling idea because I am a seasoned knitter at this point. I have been actively knitting as my pretty much main hobby for like 13 years. So I've made all kinds of things. But I've also always been on a very tight budget when I was knitting anything. And so, yeah, it's a wonderful idea that pattern designers recommend a certain yarn to you, but 9 times out of 10, that yarn was just out of my price range, or it was harder to get. Maybe it was from a different country. Maybe it was discontinued because I was using an older pattern. So using the exact yarn that's recommended from the pattern is, in my experience, not always an option. And to be completely honest, I don't even recommend it. Hearing her talk about the fact that newer knitters are trending away from substituting yarn really made me think. And she mentions too that it's a skill that is disappearing. Yarn substitution is just a matter of looking at what the designer designed the pattern to use and then seeing what other yarns that are available to you meet similar criteria and then matching them up. And that's all that it is. So in my mind, this is literally just picking yarn for a project. It has nothing to do with, am I going to get the yarn from the pattern designer or not? It's just part of knitting. And so the fact that that has trended away is sad to me. It's kind of mildly disturbing because it just contributes to that consumerist mindset that we have to buy that exact yarn that they have. But that is so far from the truth. You can make do with all kinds of things that you have. And so I thought not only was this a nice opportunity to show you my very cute vest that I'm very excited to have just in the time for fall. It is perfect colors and everything. It is fall vibes all the time right now. And it's also sleeveless and holey, so I can still wear it in Florida, which is kind of a miracle because it's still like 90 degrees outside. But anyway, I thought that this would kind of be an interesting time to show you some of the times that I have done yarn substitution, which is most of my projects, to be honest. I think I can count on my hand the times I have actually used the recommended yarn, and usually that was just because I happen to already have the right kind in my stash. I always work from stash, and so I always substitute yarn, and it almost always works out. So I wanted to show you a few of my projects and just explain the thought process behind choosing the yarn, how I go about choosing a yarn to substitute, what type of consideration I give it, and then show you some of the projects that worked out, some that didn't. So I have a trusty list here of a few of the sweaters that I have made. I thought it's always good to start with the good ones, right? Which, to be completely honest, could be most of my sweater projects. I have knitted 39 sweaters. Why can I never remember this number? But it's always changing. I'm always making more. But I have knitted somewhere around 39 sweaters in the time that I've been knitting. And like I say, most all of them have had substituted yarn, and most all of them worked out great. So I earmarked a couple of them to show you that this was just a super simple thing to do. The first one that I thought I would show you is another one that's the same color as this, which is my owl again. And this is a pattern by Kate Davies. She is from the UK. And so she recommended a UK yarn. It was not something that was easily attainable in the United States. This pattern recommended Chunky 100% Wool by New Lanark Wool. And I knew that I was not going to be able to get this yarn. In my stash, though, I happen to have 2 skeins of Cascade Eco Plus, which is also a chunky weight, 100% wool. And I was doing some other changes. I actually used her Owl's pullover pattern, and then I steeked that. So I was going by the numbers for the pullover, but adding in my mind that I would need a little bit more because I was adding a button band. But that change was completely on me. So the substitution of the yarn was going to work no matter what. I knew this is the same fiber content and it's the same size as the yarn that was recommended. And so I made this sweater, and it to this day is one of my favorites. I love this sweater. It came out so cute. Another sweater that I love that came out great that I substituted the yarn for is the Moan Cardigan by Engineering Knits. She reverse engineered a vintage sweater that she owned and created this pattern. And she gives some recommended yarns. She does recommend that sport weight works the best, but she made several versions and did a video about it, showed the differences between each size of yarn, how they came out. And so when you go on the Ravelry page, it recommends Knit Picks Palette, Knit Picks Heatherly Sport, or Knit Picks Swish DK. And all of these are wool yarns. They all are different sizes though. So one of them is fingering, one is sport, one is DK. And you can achieve this pattern with any of those sizes. You just have to make sure that you get the right gauge with your needle to make the right size. But having watched her video, and she does go into all kinds of detail about it, so I knew sport weight is going to work the best. And since she recommended wool for this design, I wanted to stick with something wool. So I took to my stash, and again, I don't have a ton to choose from in sport weight. I just, in my stashing, have not bought as much sport and DK for whatever reason that is. I'm not entirely positive. In my mind, sport and DK tends to be a little more expensive. At least that's what I thought for a really long time. So I didn't buy as much. Also, a lot of the patterns I knew I was wanting to make were worsted weight or fingering weight. So that's primarily what I focused on stashing. I did, however, get some Knit Picks Upcycled Alpaca Blend Sport on their 246 sale a couple of years ago. And so these were $2 a skein, and I got so many different ones. I got a sweater quantity of several colors, and then some of them I only got a couple of skeins because I knew I could use them as accent colors. So this yarn, since it was the right gauge for the pattern and it was partly wool and it's alpaca with the wool, so I knew it was going to perform similar to a wool. Like alpaca is a fiber that's similar to wool. It just adds a little bit of drape in my experience. Like it's a little warmer, and it also might just make things a little drapier than they would be if it was 100% wool. But that can completely depend on the wool as well. So I knew that this was going to be a great yarn substitution. It was the right size. I got the right gauge. The swatch looked really nice. So I knitted that sweater, and I love it. I think it's very cute, and it came out absolutely how I would want it to. Yarn substitutions aside, it looks great. Another category of sweaters that you're pretty much always going to be forced into doing a yarn substitution on are vintage sweaters. I knitted a pattern from a Best Way knitting pamphlet, which is a yarn pamphlet company from the early 1900s in the UK. So the recommended yarn has been long discontinued. For this pattern, they did recommend WB Melody 3-ply wool. And this pattern is from 1943. In 1943, 3-ply wool was incredibly popular. Most vintage 1940s patterns call for 3-ply wool. If you've ever tried to search for 3-ply wool, it is not something we do like we used to. We've now switched to like 2-ply, 4-ply, and it's not to say that our modern yarns can't work. It's just that it's not the same thing. The plying does affect the stitch definition. It affects the size of the stitches, how much they poof up after you've blocked it. So there's a lot of different considerations when you're trying to substitute a vintage yarn. You also have the added bonus that they usually don't give you very great gauge descriptions in these patterns either. So I made the Susan Shaw cardigan because the actress on the cover of the pattern is Susan Shaw. So we call it the Susan Shaw cardigan. And I love this cardigan, but it was a bit of a process to figure out what yarn would work, and then getting the gauge correct for my size required me to pull back a lot and redo a lot of knitting. So I did use Knit Picks Stroll for this, which is a fingering weight. 3-ply is typically also fingering weight yarn. And I just made sure to try to get the gauge as close as I could. But on this one, I didn't have very detailed gauge information, so I was making the pattern work at the gauge that I got because I knew I wanted to use this yarn. So that's kind of a subcategory. With vintage designs, you're pretty much always going to have to substitute the yarn. And so you just want to find something that has similar properties. The wool that they recommended was 100% wool. The one that I got was 75% wool, 25% nylon. So I knew it was going to perform really similarly, and it was going to be close enough that I could get the gauge right. Now let's talk about some of the ones that they worked out. I like the sweater, but it didn't work out quite as well as those others. And I will tell you what things I forgot to think about that made them not work out. So the first one I want to talk about is the sun shower cardigan. So this is an Andy Satterlund design. She released a book for knit picks that had like 5 different patterns in it. And it's just such a cute lacy pattern. I loved this design and I knew I wanted to make it as a summer cardigan. So I decided to use cotton yarn. This pattern was designed for wool yarn. Andy recommends Knit Pick Swish worsted because let's be real, she was doing this pattern collection for Knit Picks. So of course it's going to have a Knit Picks yarn recommended. And Swish is a lovely yarn, but I just didn't have the budget for it at the time. Also, I was making this for the outfit along, which is in July and August. And so it was so incredibly hot. The thought of putting a wool sweater on my body is literally offensive when it's that hot outside. So I wanted to make this work for cotton yarn, and I used Lion Brand Cotton Ease, which is 50% cotton, 50% acrylic. I had not worked with cotton all that much though, and I had heard people say cotton stretches out, but I was also thinking, well, yeah, cotton t-shirts stretch out while you wear them, but then they shrink back when you dry them in the dryer, right? So I was anticipating that, yeah, it might bag out a little bit while I wear it, but then I'll wash it and it'll just go right back to how it's supposed to. And it does not. I actually made alterations to like the waist size because my waist was technically wider than what the pattern was written for in comparison to my bust. And so I left off some of the decreases at the waist, and I should not have done that. I can look at it now and it bags out at the waist so quickly that it just doesn't feel as cute. I like that kind of waist defined 50s silhouette, which is what this sweater is, and I'm just not getting it with how it looks on me, and it's because of the yarn that I used and the changes that I made to the pattern. So if I had knit this in the cotton yarn, but I had done the pattern as written, like anticipating that the waist is going to get wider as I wear it, and just left it, it probably would have been okay. But because of the yarn that I chose and the alterations I made, it just gets too big too fast. And so as much as I like this, and I did wear it for a little while when I first made it, I wore it every so often because it's a lacy white cardigan, but it does not get the wear that I had hoped it would at the time. And it is absolutely because I didn't think about the fact that cotton is going to perform differently than wool. Another sweater that sadly, I don't know that I've ever worn it more than a couple of times is the Blaster cardigan, which is also an Andy Satterlund design. This was for her fall knit along one year, and I love the design. I think it's very cute. She designed the lace to look like an old school video game, which I always thought was really cute. And I did buy the yarn for this project, which is kind of wow. I usually don't. And I bought fancy yarn too. I thought that I was getting the perfect yarn for this. She recommended Studio DK by Neighborhood Fiber Co., which is 100% merino. I didn't have enough DK yarn on hand, so I started searching and I found a quantity of Filatura de Croza Zara on eBay for a really good price. And it was a bright orange color. I was making it in the fall. So I just went for that. And that is what I made this sweater in. Interestingly, I'm going to say this one is not 100% my fault that it didn't work out perfectly. I did not know that Zara yarn was superwash. Usually on Ravelry, it'll say 100% superwash wool as the description, and it didn't. It just says merino. So I thought I was getting 100% merino, and it wasn't until after I finished the sweater, again, making some alterations for my waist to bust ratio, and I blocked the sweater, I tried it on, and it was baggy. And so I was thinking, did I stretch it out too much when I blocked it? But then I started talking to other people about it, and they said, oh, it's because you used a superwash wool. And I had used superwash wool on other projects before, but never on a sweater. So this was kind of shocking. I had no idea at the time that superwash wool tends to grow. It's a wonderful thing that wool can be thrown in the washing machine and that you don't have to worry about it felting. But at the same time, you are trading the precision of that fit because all the times that you wash it, it is going to grow a little bit. And when you're making a fitted 1950s style cardigan, that's just not what you want. And so this sweater has always been a bit big, and it's always been so disappointing because I'll reach for it. I've worn it on like Halloween because it's bright orange and I just leave it unbuttoned. But every time I'm like, yeah, I'm going to give that sweater another try, and I put it on, I'm always like, oh, yeah, it just looks sloppy. It's just a bit too big. It's not the look that I wanted. And so it's always been a bit disappointing. And it's just because I didn't pay attention to the fact that it was superwash wool. I have a couple of others that I consider they're not good and they're not bad. They're just different. So I figured this would be a separate category of yarn substitution. One that immediately came to my mind was the Dalloway blouse from Squid School of Vintage Knitting. So this is designed after a vintage Jiffy pattern. It's one of those that said you could knit it in a day or some kind of ridiculous claim like that. And it's designed to be knitted in wool, but it's an extremely lacy design. And I saw it and I knew I had this bamboo yarn in my stash. And I actually asked Sydney if she thought that a bamboo yarn would work for this because it seemed like it would to me. And she responded and said, yeah, it should. Just keep in mind that the drape is going to be different and things like that. And so I jumped right in. I knitted that. And it's very cute. In the end, it's not my style, so I don't wear it basically because of that. But I also didn't know entirely how to work with rayon yarn, and so there's some visible mistakes that I couldn't fix on my stomach area, so I'm a little self-conscious about that. But a lot of it is it's just not my style at the end of the day, so I don't really wear it. But it technically did work. I just had to, again, keep in mind, bamboo is very slick and it's very drapey. So when I was trying to make these adjustments to the mistakes that I had made in the lace pattern, hiding that yarn after I was done doing whatever, even weaving in the ends on that sweater was an absolute nightmare because the entire thing was this very open lace work. It's like a mesh shirt. And so there's hardly any stitches to hide the yarn in. And then you add in the fact that bamboo is incredibly slick and does not want to grip itself. So I just have all these little ends that would pop out all the time because there's just no avoiding that. Bamboo is going to be bamboo. The other one that I consider kind of in the middle is actually a project that I'm working on right now. Back in the spring, I cast on the Morticia sweater. It's another Andy Satterlund design, and it's designed to be knit in a wool nylon blend. But again, I didn't have the yarn that was recommended. I wanted to use yarn from my stash. And after the experience that I had had with my other bamboo yarn, I decided to go for bamboo again because it's incredibly soft. And I was thinking that if I had a stockinette background that I wouldn't necessarily have the problems with hiding the ends like I did on the Dalloway blouse. So this is Yarn Bee Spinesse that I picked up at Hobby Lobby in their summer clearance a couple years ago, I think. And it is a 75% rayon, 25% polyester blend. Very soft, very drapey, and it's one of those that I actually kind of had buyer's remorse when I bought it. It's a little shiny, and so to me it looked a little cheap, if that makes sense. Hopefully that doesn't sound elitist, but I knitted a swatch for this sweater and it actually looked really nice. I don't think it looks cheap when it's knitted up. So I had enough of this blue color and I just really wanted to make this sweater. This is another lacy design, except that it's the sleeves that are lacy instead of the body. And as you can see, I have the body done. I have one sleeve partly done. I started running into snags because I couldn't read my knitting and I was getting the mesh part wrong on the sleeve. So I kept having to rip back and I just got kind of tired of having to fix it all the time. And so I set it aside since it is a long sleeve sweater, knowing that I wasn't going to wear it in the summer anyway. So now that we are in the fall and I've finished the other projects that I was working on, it was time to bust this baby back out. Back to yarn substitution though, obviously a rayon poly blend is going to perform so much differently than a wool nylon blend. For the record, most sock yarn is wool nylon blend. The one that she used was only 10% nylon, but even so, nylon performs similarly to wool and it maybe adds a teeny bit of drape, but as you can see, my banana sock here holds its shape. It doesn't want to flop over easily, right? Whereas this sweater, if I hold this like that, it completely conforms to my hand. Like it is incredibly drapey because this is rayon. And that's honestly what we love about rayon, right? If you wear rayon clothes, they're very flowy and floaty. Skirts and dresses and shirts and things like that. They they float away from the body, but they hug in the right places, right? So I knew that going into this, and I'm really happy with how this one is turning out. We're going to see how it ends up in the end, because obviously I'm not done. But for this type of project, I knew that the weight and the drape of the rayon itself was going to work because it had a lot of lace that I wanted to drape, and it had just a basic stockinette body. So when I want to substitute yarn, which is basically all the time, I go into my Ravelry stash information, and the first thing I usually select is the size that I need. Then I scroll all the way down on the left-hand side. There's an optional menu you can pop up that says yardage. Most designers have an estimated yardage of what you're going to need, and so I look at what the top is for my size range and I put that in. Sometimes I'll round up, like if they say it's going to take 730 yards, I'll put in 750 or 800 just to make sure that I know I have enough to complete that project. And then my Ravelry will show me everything in my stash that has that size of yarn in at least that quantity or more. And from there, I mentally, discount the ones that are earmarked for something else and look through and see what things surprise me that I'm like, oh, right, I forgot about that. That one would work perfect for this. If it has a very similar fiber content, I don't really even bother doing a swatch as far as to see if I like it. It's only if I'm doing something drastically different than what the pattern was designed to be fiber-wise that I do a swatch. And by that, I'm not saying I don't do gauge swatches. I always do gauge swatches. But sometimes you want to see how a certain stitch pattern will look in the yarn that you're using if it's a different yarn than what was recommended. So for this vest, I did this swatch. I did a section that was just stockinette because I wanted to see what the gauge was in stockinette. And then I wanted to see how the feather and fan pattern looked. And so I did a little section of that as well. And this is, just a standard 4 or 5 inch gauge swatch. I usually just guess. I'm like, oh, I'm using this size of yarn, so let's cast on 30 stitches or whatever. And then I knit a square and I see what my gauge is. I actually didn't even block this. I should have. I should have been good and I should have blocked it and measured it on a blocked gauge. But what I did was I pinned this out to the gauge that the pattern recommended and then looked at the fabric to see if I liked how the stitches looked in that gauge. And in this one, it worked out great. When I pulled everything out like it should be, you can kind of see through that if you look really close in that stockinette section. But when it's up against me, it's not enough to actually notice. And as you can see, there's really not a lot of stockinette in this project, so I wasn't super concerned. But I knew that the feather and fan was going to look good. I knew size-wise that it was going to work out. I knew that I was probably going to have to lengthen it because the wool wants to scrunch up a lot more than cotton. Cotton is heavy and it will pull that length down over time. And I knew that the designer anticipated that. So she actually gives you a pre-blocked gauge in the pattern of how long you want to make the side. So I tried to be really conscious of that. I knew where I wanted it to hit in the end. And I kept pulling my knitting to see, okay, does that look good if I pull it to this point? And so when I got to the point that I thought it was the right length and I tried it on, I tried to hold it in the center and pull at the side, and it looked good. So I knew that I had reached the size that I needed it to be. But those are things that you need to consider when you're switching fiber types from what something is designed to use. Generally, if it's designed for cotton, you can pretty much go to a wool and it's not going to give you a lot of problems. But as I showed with some of my others, if something is designed for a wool and you switch to a cotton, you need to think about that. You need to think about the weight of the cotton. You need to think about how much it wants to stretch over time. And so it just has extra considerations depending on the fiber that you use. And I have literally always done this. So that is my bit of advice. If you are a newer knitter, please don't be afraid of yarn substitution. You just need to pay attention to the size of the yarn and the fiber content, and then adjust in your mind accordingly, and everything will work out. You don't have to spend $250 on a sweater because this independent designer was gifted that yarn by an indie dyer, and that's what they made their sweater out of. Not that it's bad to support indie dyers. I absolutely love indie dyers. I think that they provide a beautiful product and they absolutely should be compensated for their time and effort. I have no qualms with what they charge. But for me personally, if it came down to, oh, I want to make this sweater, but it's going to cost me $150 for the yarn, that's just not feasible for me. I like to knit all the time. And if every one of my sweaters costs $150, that adds up really quickly. And so I'm therefore very limited as to how many projects I can be working on if I'm blowing my entire budget on one project that now I can't make something for another 6 months because I don't have the money to buy more yarn. So I hope that this can be encouraging to you if you have not tried yarn substitution before. It is not as scary as you think. There are also websites that will help you with yarn substitution. I don't use them personally. I use Ravelry, but there is, I think it's even called yarnsub.com or something like that. But there's places where you can put in the type of yarn that you're wanting to substitute, and it gives you a list of yarns that work perfectly for it. So other people have gone to great lengths to help the world at large to substitute yarn because it's just what we do. It's just what we do with knitting and crocheting. It's all going to work out. Don't let it stress you so much. So that is all I have for you today. I hope that you enjoyed this. I hope that this information was helpful. If it was, please let me know in the comments. And if you like this, please do give me a thumbs up. Subscribe if you want to stick around and see more of the projects that I am making all the time, and to pick my brain about random topics like this that making some of my projects brings to mind. And come to that, if you have any topics that you would like to get more information on, that you would like me to make a video about, please let me know in the comments. I very much appreciate your input of what you would like to see. Until next time, I hope that you, wherever you are enjoying the transition in seasons as much as I am, and that you find the perfect yarn to substitute for the pattern that you want to make.